when you were talking about did this
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then I like same thing like with
The capstone presentation is an opportunity to work with the TRB teaching standards, which are aligned to both what a teacher education program must contain, but also the responsibilities and the domains that a professional educator are required to consider. The term professional is quite contested in the literature because how can we tell people who to be when teaching is such a personal profession, and yet at the same time we understand that there are certain attributes that are important to have within your professional understanding to refer back to and to be able to communicate to parents, to your employer, and also to hold yourself accountable.
Well, there are 9 professional standards that teacher candidates have to meet in their teacher education program in order to become certified. And the TRB is a branch of the Ministry of Education, part of the provincial government, that certifies teachers. And so teacher ed programs, once our teacher candidates have met the standards, then we recommend them for certification by the TRB.
The capstone projects at WICTEP are a final culminating activity or task that every teacher candidate does in the final week of the program.
It is a celebration of the teacher candidates' learning. It's a coming together, a pulling together, a tying together of all of the different parts of the program. They've come in with their own experiences, they do coursework, they do practicum, they do community field experience, and now in their capstone they're able to tie all of their learnings together and apply them to the professional standards program competencies.
There's so much in a capstone presentation that is really beneficial for all new practicing teachers because it gets you to think about your pedagogy, it gets you to think about what's in your heart as an educator, and you really start to go, okay, here's who I am. And that is not just beneficial in interviews, I mean that's a transferable skill, but it's really beneficial as you enter into your own classroom as a sense of identity. Like, who am I as a teacher? What am I walking in the door with? And if you don't do that capstone, you have all this great learning that you've done, but you might not have had enough time to synthesize it and really personalize it. So the capstone personalizes that for students.
The capstone presentations, I think, really help us as professionals know where our standards are so we can do our jobs as professionals.
I would describe my capstone as really just like an in-depth exploration of who you are as a teacher. You're really having to reflect on not only things you've done in practicum, things you've learned about in class, things about talking with other educators. Like, you're really having to deep dive into the depths of your mind and find out, what do I really value as a teacher? What is important to me? But also, what's going to be important to my students?
I would describe our capstone presentation as kind of the culmination of everything we've been working towards. We've done those pedagogical stances for 2 years and really showing that how we embodied that in our practicum and how we embodied that to ourselves throughout this entire learning journey.
So the capstone to me was kind of the culmination of 2 years of learning and growth throughout the program, kind of culminating as an overall, it might sound cheesy, but like a love letter to ourselves as an educator. This is who I am, whereas for the past 2 years, it's been, this is what I'm learning. The capstone project is that opportunity and chance to say, this is who I am as an educator. This is where I'm going as an educator.
It does begin right at the beginning of the year as we introduce them to the program competencies. And at that point, we introduce them as the foundational competencies of not only a teacher ed program, but as practicing educators, where they come from. And we ask them to reflect at that point as to where's their understanding and their competence. So right in the first week, we get them to kind of explore and play around with those competencies and those ideas of having foundational goals of practice. You know, briefly unpack what they are and then say, based on what you think and what you know right now about learning and education, and where do you think you are in that journey? And so we do that in that first week of the program, and then we revisit those periodically and ask them to consider particular competencies that we've been working on, and what do they know now, what do they still need to know. And so that not only hopefully helps guide their own personal kind of questioning and reflection, but also help guide us in our practice and how we iterate within our coursework.
It's really connecting the pieces. So as I started to connect the pieces in the beginning, it was very loose connections, I'll be honest. But now I'm starting to really see, and I think doing my practicum helped me figure out where those capstone pieces really needed to go, and it anchored them to my practice.
So the process of building our capstones over time was similar to our pedagogical stance building, where there was a really awesome scaffold of having the standard 9 and working with them and just kind of dipping our toes in at the beginning to represent that. And then now that we're going towards the end of our journey with RRED, taking that information and making it much more explicit and much more intimate with the knowledge that we have.
It's a lot of really breaking down the TRB standards and thinking about, how am I doing this in the classroom? What has influenced me to do what I'm doing and why I'm doing it in the classroom? So it's a lot of breaking down examples from practicum. It's a lot of looking at building learning statements that are reflective of those TRB standards, and really just thinking about what it means to you as a teacher to have this pedagogy.
And as I've had that opportunity to connect them, there are some standards that don't have as much evidence, that don't have as much experience, that those are going to be areas of growth for me in my early years as a teacher. And the other statements that had a lot of evidence, it shows that those things are important to me and that I'm well on my way to achieving some of those standards.
Learning about the TRB standards and really finding out different ways of how that looks to incorporate it into your practice was so valuable to me as a teacher coming in to the field of education, because oftentimes during my education growing up, there wasn't a safe space. There wasn't a place where I felt that I was seen and valued in the classroom.
How I, as an educator just coming out of this program, how I'm meeting those standards, and how down the road I might, if I feel like I'm not meeting those standards, just going back to that reflective and reflexive process of just looking at, what do I need to do to continue to be an educator that embodies those 9 standards.
So one or two of the standards I connected to my practice in my practicum was looking at honoring my students, so meeting them where they're at, really investing in them, creating those relationships. And the more time I put in with the students and got to know them, I really started to see the learning happen. So that connection of making sure that we're caring about our students, we're creating community with them, we're getting other members of our community involved in their learning, and building those relationships is kind of 2-in-1 there. I felt that really helped with the learning process and helped me see where I needed to grow as a professional. I also used a lot of knowledge from our local community. So looking at that Indigenous perspective, who are the local persons? What is the history there? And I tried to put that into every lesson that I taught.
So the 2 standards that I probably would connect to most would be Standard 9 and Standard 1. Standard 1 looks at valuing the success of students and meeting them where they're at. That is my main pedagogy when it comes to being a teacher. I am so focused on making sure that each of these students not only feel valued in the class, but feel appreciated and seen. And that is so vital to me as a teacher. As well as Standard 9, being an Indigenous educator, that is by far and away the most important thing to me, is how can I interweave different knowledge bases so that my students are getting a multi-perspective approach to education.
Just reviewing my TRBs the last few days, they connect with most of our own knowledge as an Aboriginal person, Indigenous person. I've added to my capstone things that I've learned in my practicum. One of it was listen for their answers. So if there's something that they want to learn, that's another thing that I did through my course was I learned that you ask the student, what would you like to learn? Ask for permission. In our way, we ask the plant for permission. If we can take it, you can hear if they say yes or no. So asking a student permission. What would you like to learn? How do you feel today? Connecting with that relationship part. Building a community with the families, getting to know who they are, and bringing them into you. Because the kids come in with their own knowledge. We don't know everything at the beginning, so they're always in with their own knowledge, and just listen. When we went out onto the land, I didn't know anything about their land. It was somebody else's territory. So the students, tiny as they were the ones that guided me. So it was beautiful.
All right, so diversity and inclusion within the capstone process were really key aspects that flowed throughout our entire program. Inclusiveness of learners in the classroom is so important as we look at our low floor, high ceiling. And as we look at our students in the classroom, that inclusiveness has to be a key part of what we do as educators, because we have so many different students in our learning space, including ourselves as lifelong learners. The diversity in the classroom, where people come from, they bring with them their home, their backgrounds, their love and passion. And if we are missing that in our classroom, our learners aren't going to have the full potential that they can have to show us who they are as learners.
The best teachers are always those who are re-examining what they know, because as they're unlearning and relearning, they're developing a more holistic and inclusive approach, that they're taking in considerations that maybe they hadn't thought of before. So this is particularly true around Standard 9, where a lot of our teacher candidates come from backgrounds that may not have looked at privileging and looking at how to incorporate Indigenous perspectives, ways of knowing, into the education system, because it just wasn't done in the past, the education system they grew up in. To see these teacher candidates come in, maybe being a little apprehensive and nervous about how they're going to do that because they didn't experience it themselves, but then seeing them develop and get confidence and actually really authentically incorporate Indigenous perspectives into their teaching practice has been a great example of the unlearning and relearning.
Standard 9 is the newest standard. It does connect to another standard that has to do with diversity. But by specifically attending to Indigenous knowledge and truth and reconciliation and the ongoing process of unlearning much of what we are or think Canada to be, it really moves us towards a practice of thinking about and lifting up Indigenous knowledge as equal to other knowledges. And in so doing, it creates an incredible opportunity to not just think about content that we bring into our teaching, but more ways of knowing and beings that are more holistic, that are connected to local ways of knowing, and that really recognize that partnering with Indigenous folks in our communities, in our schools, is a practice of relationship and reciprocity, respect, and from an Indigenous perspective, reverence. How can we be with each other in ways that move us from this is what I know to how can we come to know together in different kinds of ways? And what does that offer all kids in our classrooms to understand that there are multiple ways to be, and that when we engage with them or come to understand them, we ourselves grow a little bit more, because there's so much more than what we know. And if we can kind of move to the edge of our knowing through our encounters with folks from other backgrounds, other perspectives, other epistemologies, it really moves us from kind of like a colonizing perspective of reproducing something based on outcomes to understanding education as a practice of relationship and learning together through plurality. And we come to understand something deeper when we understand it, or at least explore it in more than one way.
I think when you're preparing your capstone, really look at not just what you're thinking, but also like what you're doing in your action. So what did you do over the 11 months or the 2 years of that program? And what do your actions say about what you value, what is important to you? I think sometimes we're very heady when we're talking about education, and I really believe we need to sink it into our hearts and our bodies a lot more. So what does the action say? So what are you practicing in your classrooms? What are you practicing with your colleagues? And that action will help you go, okay, these are my important values, and that should help frame your capstone.
The biggest part was throughout the whole time of the practicum, I started right off with the potlatch because that's something big, and I wanted the non-Aboriginal students to learn about what we do in our community, what gifts that we give out for being thankful, because there's different types of potlatch, and ours was, we named it to be thankful. Just a special way to say thank you, even if it was a small gift.
Capstone for me really brought home the aspects of who I am as an educator and doing the best that I can to stay within those ethical boundaries to not only make my classroom a safe community, but also to make sure that I'm staying within those boundaries to create those spaces where community can come into the classroom and have that transparency.
When you're preparing for either of these presentations, like the PED stance or the capstone, I think what's really important is to make it individual. And we as a cohort have had the opportunity to ask each other questions and support each other and peer review each other's work, but ultimately it has to be yours. And I think that that's probably the most important thing to remember, and to relax. I think each term we get worried about this presentation and then we do it and we're like, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal. It really just has to be what's at the heart of your practice, and that's the main thing that needs to come out.
Think of it not as an assignment to finish or a checkbox to tick at the end of this program, but as that reflective practice. It isn't about getting a grade, because it's not like that. It's about looking at where you're at and who you are, and like being really proud of that, and then where you want to go, so that you have kind of a little bit of a rough map going forward.
I think what's significant is all teachers in British Columbia have to adhere to those 9 standards. And so this process through this capstone allowed me to say, this is how I'm meeting it. This is what I want to work on. So for instance, I mentioned what was really important was that I continue to develop stronger summative assessment as an educator. And so by naming that, I'm showing that deep reflection of how I want my learning to move forward, because I think that's important. Because I think if 5, 10, 15 years down the road, if I'm not thinking about how my practice directly ties to those standards, then I'm kind of, I don't know what the word would be, like I'm disconnecting myself from my responsibilities as an educator.
Something that I would want people to know coming into this program is that there is a wonderful scaffolding from day one to the last day, where the journey is laid out for us, but it is our own path to walk.
A number of our teacher candidates talked in the presentations of their capstones about how this was a way that they could continue to calibrate how they're doing in their learning, to continue to grow, that the standards are a way of them checking in with themselves and measuring themselves throughout their career, so that they can continue that journey of being the very best teacher that they can be.
I've had a chance to witness the capstones for over a decade now. That's a lot of teacher candidates across the 3 cohorts that I work with really closely through UBC. And they're kind of different student to student, but they're also kind of different cohort to cohort. And so rather than having a standardized practice, it's much more about engaging together with the teacher candidates in a practice of reflection, sense making, but also thinking about these standards as a way for us to reflect on where we are and where we want to go. it has been really important to find ways that this doesn't feel like a hoop to jump through or a box to check off, but instead of really a way to honor yourself as an educator, the growth that you have had, the sense that you've made, and looking ahead to all the ways that you can continue to grow and learn throughout your profession as a lifelong learner.